Okay, so now that we got the basics of sculpting our terrain, I want to cover just a couple of other things that will help us to enhance our environment and give us a little bit of context for the environment that we're designing. Now remember, this is not the start of our island design project. This is just a sandbox project, an experiment or an exercise to better understand some of the tools and capabilities within Unity before we start the design process. Okay, so the first thing that I want to point out is that right now it seems a little bit limited in terms of our ability to texture our island. We can go into the paint texture brush and we can add some textures, but based on that definition of the textures that we want to use, there's very limited textures in here. Again, we're looking for kind of the top-down tiled seamless textures, not these billboard or profile style graphics. We also have some other effects that we just want to avoid. Stained glass doesn't seem appropriate, although it seems kind of cool. There's very limited textures in our current library. Now, we could make our own textures, but we're going to reserve that for a future demonstration. But what we could do is we could also go out into the Unity Asset Store. This is the same place where we bought Playmaker. And public service announcement, Playmaker is currently on sale, and that sale will be ending, at least at the time of this presentation. We do need it for the class, so if you haven't grabbed it, grab it today. I'm going to jump into the Asset Store. So from Unity, I'm going to go to Window, and I'm just looking for the Asset Store. There it is, Command 9. And once we get into the Asset Store, you're going to need to log in with your Unity ID. So I can see in the top right-hand corner, I'm currently logged in. And I could search for different kinds of assets, but if we scroll down, I want to point out that in the top free section, if we click on top free, one of the top items is this terrain assets. And these are terrain assets that are published by Unity. If we click on that, we can see that it brings up a package of terrain assets with some trees and some textures. I'm going to import that directly into my project. Now it is free, and this is the publisher. It's by Unity Technologies, and you can search terrain assets to find this if it's not available in the top of the top free section. I'm going to hit import, and this will decompress the package. It'll download it from the Unity Asset Store and incorporate it directly into this project. Now I'm going to hit the import button. It'll take a moment for it to import, and once I do, I will now have access to all of that content inside my project folder. Now I'll see that represented in two different places. I should be able to dig in the assets folder and find where this stuff is being placed. In fact, it looks like it's being built in a terrain assets folder. And now I see that I have a terrain assets folder available. And I have brushes, grass, rocks, textures, and so on. But I don't actually need to necessarily dig through these folders to access this content, because if I go back to my terrain, and I go back to my paint texture brush and I go to edit textures and add a new texture, I'll start to find that there are now more textures. I have a couple of different cliff textures that I can see. And if I go down here to the grass textures, I have more variation in the grass. Now I have this muddy grass and grass meadow and so on. So I have more examples of textures that I can start to utilize. So maybe I'll just take this lawn texture and add that and make sure it's selected, and I'll come in here and just see what that gives me. I'm going to bump up my opacity a little bit so you can see that's a little different from the grass texture that I was using, and so I can maybe use that to kind of blend in and build in more of a path or add some nuance. Maybe the lowlands have more of this lawn texture where the highlands start to get a little bit rougher and sandier or rockier, but you get the idea. So we can access a lot more textures this way. And as I mentioned, we can also build our own textures, but we'll do that in another demonstration. So we can increase the number of assets that we have access to. We have access to more trees. And in a previous demonstration, I had mentioned that if we go into the paint detail, I was adding a detail mesh before, and I was looking for some rocks. And so now we have this rock mesh which we can use. And so if I double click and load this, I should be able to get in here, and with my rock mesh selected, if I zoom in, I should be able to start to paint. Now I get some really kind of crazy results because my rocks are really super dense. I'll shift click and get rid of some of those. They're also green, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense until we look at, we double click and we look at this, and the rocks, they have this healthy and this dry color. It's being using this render mode of grass. And I believe if we just change that back to vertex lit, we'll see if that changes. It didn't really change anything, but we can still tinker with this some more. Maybe I'll change that back to grass for now, but I'll just change this tint. Just get rid of these tints here and see what setting them to white gives us. Now it's a little high, so we can just kind of go in here and influence. I'll just set these kind of more towards a gray, and then depending on the environment that we want to create, I'll just hit apply. We can start to paint these rocks. Now, those are way too dense, so I will take down the opacity and the brush size. I'm still getting a lot of results, so again, I'll just kind of tinker with this until I get exactly the results that I want. But more about that later. I just wanted to point out we can start to paint in some other kinds of assets here. So now I'm going to go back into my terrain for a moment. I'm just going to back out. There's two other things that I want to talk to you about. The first is that I want to add water to this environment, because right now our island just kind of drops off into nowhere. And I think it would make more sense to have this island surrounded by water. Now there's two techniques that we could take to kind of make sure that our user has an experience that kind of makes sense. One would be to sculpt the edges of the island up. And as an example, I'll just do this really quickly. Maybe we'll raise the height to say 75 or something that makes sense. I'll bump the brush size up, and I'll be really heavy-handed with the opacity. But if I were to take this and just kind of raise the edges up, and I won't spend too much time doing this, and that may not be high enough, but if you can imagine if I did this all the way around the island, and then I look through my camera, if I happen to be looking off in the right direction, it'll be clear that I can't travel in this direction. Okay, now the only glitch here is that we see off into the horizon, and we can tell that there's kind of some dead space over here. So water is going to help a little bit with that. We could also adjust that in our skybox, which is the thing that's rendering in our sky. But let me just push this ground back down to the ground here. Just do this really quickly, or let's kind of get it back towards the ground. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I want to send that back down, because now what I want to do is I kind of want to flood my island. I want to fill it with water. And the easiest way to do that is to go into our standard assets folder. And inside our standard assets folder, there's an environment folder. And if we go inside the environment folder, you'll see that there's a water folder. And if we go into the water folder, there's two different water folders. There's water 4, presumably that's Unity 4. We're just going to go into the water, which is the latest version. And whenever we're digging through, now we get all these subfolders, but there's a prefab folder. And a prefab, that's a good indicator. That's a prefabricated object. And if I look in here, there's a water daytime, Water Pro daytime. And if I select the other one, that's Water Pro nighttime. And really the only difference is that the nighttime water is dark, or the daytime water is lighter and bluer. So I'm just going to take the Water Pro daytime, and I'm going to drag that out, and I'm going to drag it somewhere over top of my terrain, and I'll just release. And when I do, we get this little puddle. I'll just zoom in here, tap the F key. We get this little puddle of water, okay, and that water is selected. I have this object in the hierarchy here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that water and I'm going to scale it up. Currently it's 16 by 16 along the X and the Z. That's 16 meters. It's a little pond, and I want more of an ocean. So I'm going to bump this up to 1600. And I'll do the same thing on Z, 1600. And what that effectively does is kind of flood the environment. So now I can see the water. I can move that down. I can move it up. I can really kind of flood that environment and really kind of cause that water to come up. And so now we have this kind of beach-like environment with a little sandbar, and I have this lake in the center here. And if I want to just, if I want less water in here, all I have to do is go back into my terrain. I'll select my raise lower terrain. I'll take that opacity down, and I'll just kind of slowly bring that up out of the water. So I'm sculpting that up, and if I decide that I want a little bit of water over here, I'll just hold down the shift key and push that back down, so I can really be, systematic in terms of what's happening with my island and the water. So I'll just raise it above or below sea level. Okay, so we have water, we have some existing textures. Now finally, I want to make this island so that I can walk around on the island. And it's very simple to do. The first thing that we're going to do is we have a main camera. And at this point, the main camera, I moved my main camera around a little bit so that I get a better sense of when I look through my camera, I see what I have here, but I actually no longer want this camera inside my scene. So I'm going to right click on the camera and choose to delete it, or I'm going to select it and Command delete. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my assets folder, standard assets, and I'm going to go into my characters folder. Now, let me back up for a second here, because in the event that you're still looking for the environment folder and you're looking for water, if you don't have the environment folder or you don't have the character folder inside your standard assets folder, that likely means that you skipped the import package process during project creation. And that's okay, because we can always import this after the fact. If you're missing either the character or the environments folder, what you can do is go to Assets, Import Package, and then you'll see those Unity provided packages are in this list. So I'm looking at environment for water, and now I'm focused on characters, because inside the character, if I go into standard assets and I go inside character, what I'm interested in is, let me see if I can blow this up so we can see this a little bit more clearly. I'm looking for the first person character folder. And inside first person character, there's a prefabs folder. So we have some audio and scripts and some other resources, but what we're interested in is the prefabs. That's a prefabricated game object. It's kind of a combination of models and scripts and all the other things that we need. We'll take a deep dive into prefabs in future projects, but what I'm most interested in is this thing called FPS controller, or first person shooter controller. And I'm going to drag the first person controller out, and I'm going to drop that somewhere inside my my terrain, my environment. Now when I hit the play button, what's going to happen is we're going to adopt the perspective of our first person character. And now if we roll the mouse and look around, you can see that we have a mouse look set up. I'm going to use the AWSD keys to walk around, and maybe you can hear footsteps in the background. I don't think it's appropriate to have footsteps on an island, so I'm going to get rid of those. But we can strafe left and right with the A and D keys. We can move forward with the W key. S moves us backwards, and we can hit the space bar to jump. Okay. If we hold down Shift, we start to run. And I can run and jump, and there's a slope limit here that I can only go so far up an angle, and if it gets too steep, I can no longer go up that angle. So let's run here and jump off into my water. There's no splash sound, and once we get inside the water, it doesn't look the way that I'd hoped, but there's some things that we can do to make that a little bit more interesting looking. So I'm going to toggle my play button. I have a first person controller inside the scene so that I can really walk around my island. And one thing I want to point out is that it's really easy to make an interesting landscape that looks good until you start to walk around on it. Now, if I want to be able to get up on top of this hill here, I might want to rethink, one, the path. Maybe I want to paint a path inside the texture that will give me a pretty clear indication of how to get there. And I have to kind of jump my way up on top of that hill, and maybe that's not what I want to do. But once I get up here, I can look around and say, that mountain may be too small or too big. Maybe this area is too close or too far away. I can start to make some decisions about the scale and the size of my island. So that's a real quick overview of designing an exterior environment. We're going to push this a little bit further when we start our first major project. We'll start with the design process first. But for this project, for this exercise, build an outdoor environment, experiment with the landscape and the terrain tools, build up the island, and make something that we can walk around in. Build two versions, one for Mac and one for PC, and just like we did with our Gravity project, post a screenshot along with two builds of this project according to the due date that's listed in Blackboard. And if you have any questions, you can post in the discussion board, but have fun with it. Post your work to the discussion board, and I look forward to seeing the solutions that you came up with.